Welcome to Clotheshorse, the podcast that is going to Japan in 2 weeks. I'm so excited about this. I'm going to be there for a full month. And guess what? Thanks to the miracles of modern technology, or at least this really cool portable recording device that I bought a couple months back secondhand, I'm going to be producing some mini episodes while I'm in Japan, just sort of talking about my experiences there, things I've learned. I'm planning a lot of educational activities. So keep an eye out for those in November while I'm in Japan. I will tell you that when those episodes come out, it will probably not be our usual Sunday, Monday kind of thing because of the time difference and having to record it and then share it with Dustin so that he can mix it back here in the States. But I'm really excited to explore some new stuff in Japan and tell you all about it. That said, I'm your host, Amanda, and this is episode 215. And this week's guest is someone you already know, Ruby of Spokes and Stitches. And she's here to talk about all things sewing. We recorded this conversation for 3 hours, actually a little bit more than 3 hours, with only one bathroom break in my kitchen at my house here in Lancaster County. It's the first time I've done something like that. It was so much fun. And then, because we didn't cover everything, we basically had to stop recording because we both needed to go eat some food ASAP. We picked it all up a week later and recorded for another 2 hours virtually. So there is a ton of information to share with you. And I am so grateful for Ruby because she has so much expertise to share in the world of sewing, all things sewing. Stuff that I don't know at all, and I was excited to learn from her. So this episode is part 1 in this series. Part 2 will be coming next week, and there might be a part 3 coming your way when I return from Japan. It just depends how I finish out all the editing stuff, but trust me, so much more sewing information coming from Ruby in the next couple of months. In this week's episode, we'll be discussing so many things. A brief history of the mass production of clothing, why people stopped sewing their own clothing as a regular part of daily life. And I'll actually be talking about this topic more next week, along with a history of home economics education. This week, we'll also unpack the barriers that make sewing a privilege for many in 2024 and why to be honest, it's just not realistic at this point to expect everyone to start sewing their own clothes. We'll talk about why you might want to get into sewing and how you can get started on sewing even if you've never done it before. Ruby will share her advice for finding less expensive but totally rad fabric options. And of course, we're going to talk about so much more, so much to discuss, right? And this, once again, is just part 1 of this series. There's more coming your way. Because we had so much to discuss, and this is a long conversation, it was hard to find things to cut. I won't be doing my standard introduction segment this week, but I do want to make 2 announcements / shout outs before we jump in. One, I always say this at the end of the episodes, and maybe many of you do not hear this. Please subscribe if you like this podcast. Please rate, and most importantly, please review Clotheshorse. These are all things that help bring the podcast to more people, and it's a way you can show your support for Clotheshorse without spending a cent. And this is just totally personal and low-key semi-embarrassing, but I'm just going to tell you anyway. A podcast that just launched maybe not even 6 months ago was on Instagram asking for reviews, and I went to leave them a review. And I was like, holy crap, this podcast has only been around for a few months and it has more reviews than Clotheshorse, who's been around for 4.5 years. And I got really sad and was like, well, I'm a failure. But I realize now that perhaps I'm just not reminding you to leave a review. And if you hate this podcast, well, I don't know why you're here, but please don't leave a review because mean reviews hurt my feelings and make me sad, and they don't really change anything, but they do succeed in making me feel bad. So anyway, rate, review, subscribe. It means a lot and it doesn't cost anything. The other thing I wanted to call out is, as I said at the top of the episode, I am leaving for Japan in a few weeks, which means while I'm gone, you will not be able to order merch like the iron-on transfers and stickers. I mean, you'll be able to order them, but you won't receive them until I return from Japan the week of Thanksgiving here in the United States. And that's something I was thinking about for a while. I was like, oh, I could ask Dustin to pack orders for me while I'm gone, but that just felt rude. So get your orders in by October 27th. Otherwise, wait until the end of November. And Dustin and I are finalizing some new iron-on transfers that we're going to be putting up for pre-sale in the coming weeks. So keep your eyes out for that too. But for anything that already exists, order it now. We're almost out of unskilled labor is a classist myth transfers. I mean, literally like almost out. There's like 5 left. And after that, there won't be any more until I return from Japan. So if you've been procrastinating or you wanted to get a head start on making some iron-on gifts for your loved ones, now is a great time to place those orders. All right. All the boring stuff out of the way. Let's jump into something way more interesting, my conversation with Ruby. All right, Ruby, you've been on here so many times before, but do you want to just remind everybody of who you are?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for having me back. My name is Ruby Gertz. I live in Philadelphia, and I am a pattern maker and sewist. I run a sewing studio out of Firehouse Arts Germantown in Philadelphia, where I live. And I freelance as a pattern maker, pattern grader, design consultant. I also teach pattern making workshops for hobbyists and people who are starting to professionalize. And I also teach private sewing lessons. So I do a lot of things.
You do a lot of things. And Ruby is actually here at my house in Lancaster County. We're literally recording in my kitchen, which I've never done before. This is very exciting to
so
just
exciting.
Be like face-to-face recording, right? So today we're going to talk about sewing. And you know, I've said this here on the podcast before, but I've been doing this now for 4 years. I certainly have posted a lot of stuff on social media, and patterns emerge about different topics. And one thing that comes up over and over again is if I post about like how we need to buy less stuff or something about how fast fashion is lower quality, et cetera, someone will show up every time. And it's a different person every time, to be fair, to say, I don't know what's wrong with all of you. Why don't you just sew all your own clothes? That's what I do. And that can be a great solution. We can also agree that people who sew their own clothes could actually be sewing too many clothes, because I see that on social media too. People who are literally sewing, as far as I can tell, a new outfit every day, which I don't know how they do that. They must not get very much sleep or eat or do any self-care of any sort. And this must be their full-time thing, is sewing clothes, which does sound kind of fun. But the reality is that, like, yes, sewing can be an important part of the slow fashion lifestyle. It can mean you are sewing your own clothes, or you are repairing your own clothes, or you are upcycling materials into clothes. All these things, all important. There's a whole spectrum of it. But sewing itself has a lot of privilege attached to it. And we're going to talk about that today, and also just kind of give you all some advice about how you can start sewing. Once again, you don't need to sew your own wardrobe, but maybe just learning how to do some hemming would be a great thing, or how to do some simple repairs. So we're going to talk about all that stuff today. But we're going to get started by talking about kind of one of the biggest privileges, I would say, attached to sewing, which is actually knowing how to sew. So Ruby, how did you learn how to sew?
Yeah, great question, Amanda. So I was lucky enough to be taught how to sew by my mother when I was probably around like 10 or 11. Actually, before that, even, I was very into making clothing for my like stuffed animals and dolls.
I feel
as
this.
a child.
Yes, same.
Which I think is a very common trajectory for those of us that end up in fashion school.
Definitely.
But yeah, before I knew how to sew, I would just sort of like take textiles, anything, napkins, Kleenex, toilet paper, whatever, and just sort of wrap them around my dolls or stuffed animals to make, you know, like a Barbie wedding dress out of toilet paper. Who doesn't love that, right? Secured with like, you know, some tape around the waist.
We all know this experience. Maybe you color in some like with a magic marker,
totally,
like a floral print or something.
Oh my gosh,
totally.
Yeah, very, very like advanced surface textile design happening. But yeah, so I always sort of had an interest in it, and then my mother taught me how to sew kind of the most basic stuff when I was probably in like late elementary school, and then in middle school I started to really get into it a lot more. I think I kind of quickly surpassed my mom's skill set and started teaching myself. And by the time I got into high school, I had sewn a bunch of like commercial patterns, which are like, you know, those ones that come in the envelopes that you get at like Joann Fabrics. And I was just always really unhappy with the fit. Like they always came out either way too big or way too small and very boxy. And even as a young teenager, I was like pretty curvy. So stuff just like didn't fit over my body very well. So I really wanted to learn pattern making, and I actually ordered in the early days when Amazon was only a textbook.
Remember?
When Amazon was for ordering textbooks online, I actually ordered with like some birthday money or something. I ordered a pattern making textbook. And I remember like waiting by the door for it to arrive. Like I was so excited, and it came, and I read that thing cover to cover, like Harry Potter or something. Like I was just like so into it. It was very nerdy, but I kind of learned as much as I could about pattern making. Ended up going to fashion school where I learned even more about sewing and pattern making. I had the privilege to learn from a lot of like really amazing seamstresses and technical designers and people that were teaching at Pratt, which is where I did my undergrad in fashion design. So I picked up a lot of really cool, helpful tips and tricks. And then after I graduated from fashion school, I was sewing professionally as a seamstress and also working as a pattern maker, doing kind of freelance projects here and there, wherever I could get them for different companies. So yeah.
You've done a lot of sewing.
I have.
You know, I think it's really interesting, like your foundation for sewing really came from your mom. Mm-hmm. And I think for a lot of people out there who do know how to sew, it either came from a parent, a grandparent, or they learned it in school,
totally.
Right? And for me, I come from a very uncrafty, very bad at cooking family. And I don't think it's because there's lack of interest there. There's just lack of time, right? So my grandmother always worked outside the house. My mother always worked outside the house, and they just worked all the time. I have heard stories of my great-grandmother sewing clothes for my mom when my mom was in high school and younger. I've heard stories about what an amazing cook she was, but it ended there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that cooking and just crafting and sewing are like so important to me and like are mostly self-taught skills. Except that I was lucky enough, well, two things. One, I was in the Girl Scouts, which when I joined the Girl Scouts, I had this vision that I was going to be off learning all this like wilderness survival stuff and building fires and canoeing and like who knows what else. But the reality is that when I was a kid in Girl Scouts, we did a tiny bit of camping, but we sure did a lot of crafts. And that's where I learned how to do cross stitch and embroidery and like simple sewing, like hand sewing, which really upped my Barbie clothes game for quite a while. Because I would make all kinds of stuff out of any scrap of fabric or anything that was around our house for my Barbies. But obviously, they probably weren't very polished. But in middle school, here in Pennsylvania, when I was growing up, everybody was required to take home ec in 7th and 8th grade. So you learned cooking and how to like budget and how to like prepare food safely. And you also learned how to sew. And in 7th grade, you sewed an apron. And in 8th grade, you could sew a pair of shorts that the teacher called jams. And the other option, I cannot remember what it was. I made the jams.
The jams.
And I thought they were really cool. But like I wore them to school one time and someone was like, I can't believe you're wearing your jams to school. Oh. And I felt embarrassed, but they were really cool. Anyway.
Bring back the jams.
Bring back the jams. Yeah. So I learned all that stuff in school. I did not learn it at home. Mm-hmm. And I feel very lucky because most people don't get access to that education in school. They may not have the access to these like extracurricular activities like the Girl Scouts where you could learn things like that as well. And so for many people, they're sort of locked out of the sewing world or knitting or crochet or cooking or all of these other things that we once learned either in school or from our families. And we're going to go through that whole history. I remember my mom telling me specifically how my great-grandmother would sew a lot of her clothes. And for most of her childhood, that was cool until she got to high school and then she was embarrassed, right? And I think that is a very interesting thing to think about because that would have been like the 70s. I think it kind of follows the trajectory of what happened with home sewing and why we all switched to mass-produced clothing, which is interesting because now a garment that is made just for you feels like a luxury, right? But it wouldn't have always been that way. Mm-hmm. So do you want to explain to us how that happened?
Absolutely. So to kind of dive into this, we have to talk a little bit about the history of mass production of clothing. So I think we, in a previous episode, we talked about a little bit of this. I think it might be the like size charts and gender episode.
I remember now.
I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but you can look that up if you want all the details. But basically, mass production started. It's like fairly recent. It started in like the mid 1800s, and the first sort of major application for mass production of clothing was military uniforms.
Of course.
Yeah, it was actually during the Civil War in the United States. The Union Army had to outfit a whole bunch of soldiers, and they had to do it very quickly and very cheaply. They didn't have a lot of resources. And so it was the first time ever that they decided, okay, let's just sort of pick some sizes. We'll do like small, medium, large. We'll measure people. We'll make the patterns, and we'll give people a bunch of these, you know, sort of factory sewn clothes, and they'll be kind of like good enough. Previous to that, like all military uniforms were actually custom made for the wearer by military tailors.
Fancy.
I know. So like if you were joining the military, you would go see the military tailor, and they would make you your custom, your custom uniform. And, you know, or if you were, you know, poorer, you might kind of make it yourself, or maybe like your wife would make it for you or something. So this was kind of the first large-scale experiment of like, does mass production of clothing actually work? And it did.
What?
Did.
Really?
It was like, well, so it was like, and the thing is, like, it was good enough, right?
Right.
Like, things were not as finessed and like detailed as they could have been, right? Like custom, but it was like, it was good enough and it was functional, right? And it was efficient. So if for garments where you weren't concerned with aesthetics, like stuff like workwear, where maybe you had to like outfit people in a bunch of like, you know, like boiler jumpsuits to work in a factory, or, you know, kind of sturdy pants or something for doing some particular type of labor. You know, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. It just sort of matters like if it functions. And so, yeah, so this was actually like pretty cool kind of cutting edge technology. So obviously I feel like it's almost like it feels like it mirrors a lot of stuff like where we are now with technology, where like things were being pushed that people were kind of resistant to. So initially, a lot of people were pretty resistant to mass-produced clothing. Like, it felt cheap, it felt tacky, especially for women's wear and these sort of more opulent forms of dress that were more about aesthetics and more about, you know, kind of looking different from everybody else and being made for your specific figure. You know, that was kind of an intimate relationship between like women and their dressmakers, or if even just women sewing their own clothes at home. That was something that people didn't really want to give up necessarily. So it was sort of forced on people. And the rise of like the department stores, kind of by the early 20th century, really kind of gave way to making this start to feel like more of a luxury to own mass-produced clothing. So if you think about it, you know, the experience of like going to a store and like being able to see a whole bunch of clothes and pick from what was on the rack was pretty novel and pretty exciting. And it was really marketed as like this modern luxury. And we were also starting to see kind of like the end of the Victorian era, this sort of like sphere of domesticity that women were sort of confined to was starting to crack open, and more women were starting to join the workforce. And so it was kind of like, hey, you can be a modern woman and like leave the drudgery of sewing behind and just go to a store and just buy your clothes. And like, isn't that so cool and cutting edge and technologically advanced? There was also like, so a lot of early ready to wear that you would buy in these department stores, especially women's wear, was actually designed to be tailored. So it was made to be sort of boxy and shapeless at first. So you would buy it off the rack. It would be kind of like not quite the right fit, but there were often like in-house tailors at the actual store that would tailor it to fit you better. So things were made with like a lot of extra seam allowance, which means like there was extra fabric on the inside that they could pull out of if you were a little bigger in certain areas or take more out of. So they were designed to sort of be garments that were like 80% complete, and you would add those final customizations like during the purchase of those garments.
That's pretty cool.
It is
I
pretty
wish
cool.
that still existed, because if you buy a mass-produced garment now, there is literally no seam allowance.
Totally.
Because it keeps costs down.
Yes.
And you would also, in many situations, feel embarrassed that you put extra work into it because the garment is so low quality to begin with.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. So, and mass-produced clothing, like it wasn't necessarily higher quality than the stuff that was being custom made. So, you know, around that time, also, you know, we're thinking like early 20th century, like a lot of poorer women were feeling pressured to like leave rural areas and go work in textile factories and send money home. And so in a lot of ways, like those young female factory workers, they often became the perfect customers for ready to wear because they're working all the time and they no longer have time to do their own sewing. So it's almost this like ironic feedback loop where it's like, hey, we're not making any money. I have to go leave the farm and go work in this factory. I'm working in the factory. I'm doing like 14-hour days. I have no time to sew my own clothes. I guess I'll buy the cheap stuff that we're making in the factory and wear it, you know? So it's like, it kind of like feeds itself. Like they sort of become the customers for that product, for that end product. So yeah. And then when we're talking about that customization aspect too, like this idea that people would tailor things after purchasing them to fit a little bit better, that process actually kind of continued for a lot of like the 20th century, and probably by like the 70s, 80s, and 90s was when a lot of production started to move overseas to cut costs. And at that point too, which we can get into a little more, you know, a lot fewer people were sewing at home and like knowing how to sew. That was a skill that wasn't being passed down as much. And so it sort of became pointless to include all that extra seam allowance or build in that room for customization. So like you said, they were like, let's just cut the seam allowance. We don't need that. We'll just give things a 1/4 inch or whatever to like save material. There's also like increasingly during that time period, we're seeing clothing start to use more like cut and sew knit fabrics, so fabrics with stretch. And so there's kind of less need for alterations when you have a stretchier garment because there's just a lot more wiggle room in terms of like the size of bodies that one garment can fit, because it can stretch if you're a little larger, or it can just be a little looser if you're a smaller person. So.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, even in the span of my career in this century, I saw with each year that we were adding more stretch to everything with each passing year, because it would fit more people, kind of.
Yeah.
Right? It would, in theory, lower return rates since people often weren't trying things on online. And, you know, in the beginning, it was like, well, you know, leggings, T-shirts, maybe some like bodycon dresses and skirts, fine. But then it was like, okay, now we're putting elastane in like every single pair of jeans, right? Now we're putting it in button-ups. Now we're putting it in dresses. Now everything of all fabric type has stretch in it now. And that's not an accident.
No.
That's like a real strategic move that I don't really think, just as a professional, that it makes things fit people better and makes them less likely to return, just based on the data I've seen in my career. But what it definitely does is shorten the lifespan of those clothes because those fibers break over time.
Totally.
Yeah. So it's like, so, okay, you know, once again, like here we are now where like a hand-sewn garment that is bespoke just for you is like luxurious, and we all dream of like having access to that, right? Mm-hmm. How did we get to this point where that is this major luxury rather than the norm?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, it actually used to be like, you know, if you were very wealthy, you would probably have like a dressmaker or a tailor that you would go to that would like make all your clothes for you, and that was like cool. If you weren't wealthy, usually like the women in your family, or your mother, your grandmother, your older sister, whatever, you know, would sew the clothes for like the whole family. And so like things would be custom made just kind of out of necessity, but you would be making it like in your own house. And if you go back far enough in history, like at a certain point, people were even growing their own fibers for that as well. Wow. So if you think about people who were like tending sheep and like harvesting the wool, or growing flax in their backyard or something and harvesting that and turning it into linen, like a lot of times households were responsible for like their own textile production as well. So you were doing like the whole process, like start to finish. So yeah, when we talk about like why did people stop doing this, a lot of it was just like this pressure from industrialization of these different processes, for people to like stop doing that and kind of hand control over to these larger companies that were doing things faster and more efficiently and like promising them like jobs, even though those jobs maybe like were underpaid or exploitative. But there was just a lot of pressure for people to kind of like part with those older ways of doing things and sort of like join modernity. Not sure if I said that right. It came out a little weird. Anyway, and I know that you've talked about this a lot on the podcast in the past, Amanda. But during the 1980s, the Reagan administration here in the United States, they cut a lot of home economics education programs to kind of focus on funding STEM programs. Sort of as part of the Cold War, it was like, we need more scientists, we need more math people, we need more tech people. And so home economics kind of fell by the wayside. It's really cool that you got to take it, actually. I think my high school maybe had a home economics class, but it was just an elective. And it was like, I think they only ran it like once a year. And at that point, besides, like I was kind of making all my own clothes anyway. And I was like, I don't need that.
And well, also if you were like in a situation like that, where it's an elective and if you're sort of on that, like I'm going to college track, you don't have time in your schedule.
Oh,
for
totally.
That, right.
Totally.
And so it's like, who takes these classes at this point? It's so discouraged. I do feel really lucky. I wouldn't know how to do any of those things if I hadn't been forced to by the education system of the state of Pennsylvania. So thank you.
Yeah. They're like important life skills. You know, I think like in my high school, there was this perception that home economics was kind of like a throwaway class. Like it wasn't important. It was something that you took if you like if you had space in your schedule, you like didn't have other interests, you weren't pursuing like more academic paths or whatever. It was kind of looked down on as like it was like a dumb class. Like it didn't take a lot of mental capacity or something, which is total bullshit looking back, you know,
absolutely.
like these are like really good skills. I'm like, man, I wish somebody had like formally taught me like how to cook. I don't know. It just seems like very useful.
Absolutely. And I feel like, going back to Reagan, the administration, like pulling that stuff out of schools, because I have to spend so much time like thinking and reading and writing about overconsumption and kind of like how we got to where we are. When I look back like in history, I feel like there were two pivotal moments where what we know as late stage capitalism really began. And one was like post World War II, right? Like the baby boomer era, where it was like everybody was making all the things and selling all the things and looking for new ways to sell you things, right? And then it was the 80s with Reagan. Just even like the kind of advertising that we were allowed to see, selling stuff blatantly to children, like making cartoons that were about toys to sell the toys. And also I think really making these educational changes where it was like, okay, now we're going to fund very early computer kind of classes and things like that. And we're going to pull back on these like life skills, which, I mean, this is depressing, but like it created generations now of people who don't really know how to cook, who don't really know how to grocery shop, who don't really know how to sew or repair clothing or anything like that. And so what does that lead to? People who live on takeout or highly processed foods, right? That's great for these like big food companies.
Oh, totally. The meal kits, everything's like individually cellophane wrapped.
Don't get me started. Yeah, those kinds of things, right? Or people who like they can't even, I remember reading this study a few years ago that happened in the UK, and I don't know the exact statistic, but basically the majority of the people who were surveyed, if like a shirt lost a button, they would just throw it out because they didn't know how to fix it. Wow. And that's great for, all of these fast fashion brands because you're just going to keep buying more stuff. And so I get so sad when I think about this because I also think there was a concerted effort, in my opinion, in the 70s, just based on what I've read, to sort of start to stigmatize homemade clothing, that it wasn't as nice.
Yes.
As like professionally, quote, sewn clothing. And I think there's just like this perfect storm of like sewing, whatever.
Oh, totally. Totally. I think another thing that like did also play a role in that, and I've experienced this with a lot of students that I work with who are like in my age demographic of like millennials whose parents were either boomers or Gen X, who like their mothers often kind of rejected sewing as a home skill, sort of as a part of like second wave feminism. Like there was this sense of like, that's not serious. I'm not gonna waste my time on these sort of like frivolous domestic tasks, and instead I'm gonna like go off and be a career woman, or I'm gonna like have this really high paying job, and that's how I'm going to provide for my family. And I think there was, kind of like at the time it was like seen as like empowering to like sort of reject those types of skills and be like, I don't have to do that. I'm going to do this other thing instead that I have never had access to before. But it's also often kind of sad because I think it paints a lot of those tasks as like unimportant or under, not valuable. And it does sort of create this reliance on like fast food and takeout and like single-use disposable plastic stuff or like, single-use clothing even, just like things being more disposable, because there's just maybe this, this desire to like, well, I don't want to engage with that. That's kind of like old-fashioned or fuddy-duddy or matronly or something. So yeah. But so another thing that happened in the 80s was there was a lot of union busting. And
but what a time.
Yeah. So in the United States, the United States kind of has its own storied history of textile and apparel like manufacturing industries. And actually a lot of it was here in Pennsylvania. A lot of it was also in like Massachusetts and New England, which is where I grew up. So I actually have like some relatives, if you go back to like my great grandparents and stuff, who like were working in those industries, mainly in like the textile industry in Rhode Island. So over time, kind of throughout the 20th century, a lot of that industry, like there were a lot of terrible things that happened. Like we talk about like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which was like this horrible event that happened in the early 20th century when a lot of factory workers died in New York City, and that led to a lot of unionization and sort of solidarity among garment workers. So by the time we get to the 70s and 80s, like working in apparel manufacturing in the United States was actually kind of a decent job for a lot of people, not for everybody. There's still exploitation, there's still sweatshops, but a lot of times those jobs were kind of decently paid. They came with okay benefits, maybe pensions. And in the 80s, a lot of those unions were broken up and a lot of that manufacturing got moved overseas to places that had much less strict labor laws in terms of like worker protections and minimum wages and things like that. So as that kind of moves overseas, clothing also becomes a lot cheaper on the consumer end. And at a certain point, there's like sort of this calculation where even the poorest people can afford basic clothing because the price point has just gone down so much. And so it becomes less about like this thriftiness of like, oh, well, it would be cheaper for me to just buy fabric and make it myself. And more about like, well, I have to work all the time to like afford food and like housing and all these basic things. I really don't have time to sew my own clothes. It's cheaper to just buy what I need at the store. So there's sort of this like tipping point, I think, where sewing sort of becomes less about this like thrifty thing and more about like a crafty thing. So I think in the past, maybe 30 to 50 years or so, sewing has definitely become more of a luxury. So it's more of a hobby that's practiced by people who have disposable income, people who have free time. And there's the aspect of space. So sewing is something that kind of takes up a lot of space. If you think about like cutting out fabric, you often need like a large table surface. You'll need to set a sewing machine up somewhere. And considering that a lot of sewing projects often take multiple hours to complete, you're not necessarily just doing it all in one run. It's not necessarily like cooking where you're like, okay, I'm just going to like make a pot of soup. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this step today. I'll do that step tomorrow. I'll do this other step the next day. And so then it's like, do I have space in my house to like lay out all this stuff and leave the materials out? Or do I have to like clean up because I'm using my kitchen table or something and like put things away in between every single time that I'm like completing a few steps on this project? So then that also becomes a calculation that people are doing of like, do I have the space to do this?
Yeah. And, you touched on like, sewing a garment is significantly more expensive than buying a brand new garment, unless maybe you're using some secondhand fabric or repurposing something you have lying around, fine, or something you got for free. Of course, then it's going to be less expensive. But in general, if you go out today and you buy fabric and then you sit down and sew the garment, it's going to cost more than buying a brand new version of that, like that's mass produced. And I think, one of the big reasons is that, which we've talked about here before, is that the cost of clothing is too good to be true. It's too cheap to be true, right?
Yeah.
It's an illusion,
Totally.
honestly,
Totally.
that you could possibly make a dress for $5, right? And so it is like, if you are in a situation where you don't have a lot of money, it's going to be a really tough sell to that person to say, you should just sew this yourself. And it's going to cost you 10 times as much as buying this thing, right? I totally get that. And I think, unfortunately, like, something that we all of us within the slow fashion community need to recognize and let that change how we talk about slow fashion and how we bring people into our community is we need to recognize that there are cost and time barriers among many other barriers that keep people out of this movement because they think they can't afford to be a part of it.
Totally. And I think time is also a huge factor.
Huge.
If you think about, and especially, I think this calculation is almost even more relevant for folks who are poorer or working class, but it's like, how much is your time worth, right? If you think, let's say you like drive for Uber and you know that like driving for Uber, you're going to make like $15 an hour baseline, right? If it takes you like 6 hours to sew a shirt, that's 6 hours that you're not driving for Uber making $15 an hour, right? And that's significant. And so I think a lot of folks feel like, well, this isn't something that I want to give my time to. It's sort of like, it's almost like I'm like wasting money by taking the time to sew my own clothes because my time is more valuable spent in other ways, like literally valuable spent in other ways.
Yeah. To me, sometimes time is the resource that, especially in 2024, that most of us, we have the least of it, right? Because so many of us, I mean, how many different jobs do you have that you listed at the beginning of this conversation, right? And that's so many of us, right? And on top of that, you might be caring for children or an elder relative or someone else in your life, and like pets and just like so many things, right? And I was telling you as we were planning this episode that I'd had a conversation with someone who I'd wanted to like have a conversation about the barriers to sewing and why it wasn't accessible to everyone. And I said, well, you know, like some people don't have the money or time to do it. And they were like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm poor and I sew all my clothes, all my kids' clothes, etc. And I was like, well, I'll tell you, like, single parent, working full time at my shitty retail job for years, and no community support whatsoever on any level. So I'd work all day. I would be biking to and from daycare to get Dylan. We would stop at the grocery store on the way home. I'd come home, make dinner, give Dylan a bath, clean up the house. It would be time for bed to get back up at 5 and do it all again. Sewing was never going to be a part of that. If I would have had to sew my clothes or Dylan's, we would have been walking around naked because there was just, I could barely stay on top of like day-to-day life, right? And it wasn't because I was ever relaxing ever, right? There's just no time. If it was a day off of work, we got to do laundry, we got to clean the house, we got to do this, like so much stuff, right? So time, I think, more than ever is what keeps people from sewing. It's what keeps people from cooking. It's what keeps people from being able to really live a more like sustainable way of life. Oh, it's totally. Time.
Totally.
Right? Let's take a moment to thank some of the incredible small businesses who keep Clotheshorse going via their generous Patreon support. Selena Sanders, a social impact brand that specializes in upcycle clothing using only reclaimed, vintage, or thrifted materials, from tea towels, linens, blankets, and quilts. Sustainably crafted in Los Angeles, each piece is designed to last in one's closet for generations to come. Maximum style, minimal carbon footprint. Shift Clothing out of beautiful Astoria, Oregon, with a focus on natural fibers, simple, hardworking designs, and putting fat people first. Discover more at shiftwheeler.com. Late to the Party, creating one-of-a-kind statement clothing from vintage, salvaged, and thrifted textiles. They hope to tap into the dreamy memories we all hold. Floral curtains, a childhood dress, the wallpaper in your best friend's rec room, all while creating modern, sustainable garments that you'll love wearing and have for years to come. Late to the Party is passionate about celebrating and preserving textiles, the memories they hold, and the stories they have yet to tell. Check them out on Instagram at Late to the Party People. Vino Vintage, based just outside of LA. We love the hunt of shopping secondhand because you never know what you might find. Catch us at flea markets around Southern California by following us on Instagram at vino.vintage so you don't miss our next event. Dylan Page is an online clothing and lifestyle brand based out of St. Louis, Missouri. Our products are chosen with intention for the conscious community. Everything we carry is animal-friendly, ethically made, sustainably sourced, and cruelty-free. Dylan Page is for those who never stop questioning where something comes from. We know that personal experience dictates what's sustainable for you, and we are here to help guide and support you to make choices that fit your needs. Check us out at dylanpage.com and find us on Instagram at dylanpagelife&style. Salt Hats, purveyors of truly sustainable hats, hand-blocked, sewn, and embellished in Detroit, Michigan. Find us on Instagram at Salt Hats. Gentle Vibes Vintage. We are purveyors of polyester and psychedelic relics. We encourage experimentation and play not only in your wardrobe, but in your home too. We have thousands of killer vintage pieces ready for their next adventure. See them all on Instagram at Gentle Vibes Vintage. Thumbprint is Detroit's only fair trade marketplace, located in the historic Eastern Market. Our small business specializes in products handmade by empowered women in South Africa, making a living wage, creating things they love like hand-painted candles and ceramics. We also carry a curated assortment of sustainable and natural locally made goods. Thumbprint is a great gift destination for both the special people in your life and for yourself. Browse our online store at thumbprintdetroit.com and find us on Instagram at thumbprintdetroit. Vagabond Vintage DTLV is a vintage clothing, accessories, and decor reselling business based in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada. Not only do we sell in Las Vegas, but we're also located throughout resale markets in San Francisco, as well as at a curated boutique called Lux and Ivy, located in Indianapolis, Indiana. Jessica, the founder and owner of Vagabond Vintage DTLV, recently opened the first IRL location located in the Arts District of downtown Las Vegas on August 5th. The shop has a strong emphasis on 60s and 70s garments, single-stitch tees, and dreamy loungewear. Follow them on Instagram at Vagabond Vintage DTLV and keep an eye out for their website coming fall of 2022. So let's talk about some of the modern barriers to sewing. The first one we've talked about, let's go into it a little bit more, which is lack of education in terms of like knowing how to sew, which is not easy.
It's not. So yeah, I think especially like when it comes to sewing machines and like operating a sewing machine, I think hand sewing is something that can be done with like fewer resources and is maybe a little easier to like pick up and learn, and is something you can kind of do on the go. You can hand sew while you're like on the bus or the train or something. But it's also a much slower process. So hand sewing, while it can be like fun and fulfilling, you know, you can't like knock stuff out as quickly as you would with a sewing machine. And when it comes to operating a sewing machine, I think like people really underestimate like how much skill that takes. There's like a lot of nuance to it. It's almost like, I almost compare it sometimes to like learning to type on a computer or something, where it's like after a while you will build muscle memory that will help you to just kind of do things seamlessly and efficiently. But when you're just starting out, it can be really confusing. There's all these different parts that you have to remember, like, okay, is my presser foot down? Is my bobbin loaded correctly? Is my tension set up correctly? Like there's just so many little pieces that all need to like converge perfectly, and you have to kind of understand how they work together to actually like create a stitch. Sewing machines are also big and heavy, right? Like they take up a lot of space.
And they can be expensive.
They can be expensive too. So yeah. And so like we talked about before, it's like, you know, sewing used to be something that was like a skill that was usually passed down within families. Most families, at least for the past century or so, would like have a sewing machine, whether it was kept out or in a closet or one of those ones that like folds down into a table. You know, usually there are was one in the home, right? And somebody in your family would like teach you how to use it. And it was kind of seen as a necessary life skill. Like it was a very common, like sewing machines for a long time were a very, very common like wedding registry present, because it was like, you're setting up your household, you need a bunch of things. Like you should have a sewing machine so that like when stuff breaks, you can fix it, or you can like make stuff for your house. Like if you need to sew curtains, or you need to like hem your kids' pants, or like fix a hole in your husband's shirt, whatever, right? So that was kind of just considered like a standard household appliance, the way we all kind of consider it standard to have like an oven and a refrigerator these days. But now we're kind of in this point of time where like sewing machines are becoming less and less common. A lot of people have been getting rid of them, especially the older ones, because they're heavy and they're bulky and they take up space. And so, if nobody in your household knows how to sew, if you don't have a sewing machine in your home, like how are you going to learn? Where are you going to go? Who's going to teach you? And how are you going to practice too? Because sewing is also a skill that takes a lot of practice. You can't just like do it once and be like, okay, cool, I learned. It's something that you kind of do like over time again and again and get better at. So I think if you don't have a sewing machine in your home and there's nobody there in your, with you to kind of mentor you, it's very hard to get started.
Yeah.
There are places that you can take lessons, but sometimes, like we talked about, people are so busy. So if you have to go somewhere outside of your house to learn where to sew, like finding a place that offers lessons or classes that work with your schedule can be really challenging. I do teach sewing workshops, and I can say like getting adults to sign up for sewing classes, even though everybody says they want them, is such a challenge.
Right. Because we're all working so much and we have other responsibilities. And like, your classes take place in the city, but like if depending on where you live, if you don't have a car, you might not have access to a place, the financial side of it. And it really has culminated in sewing sort of being a luxury. Like I remember a few years ago thinking like, wow, it'd be really fun. This is before the pandemic. It'd be really fun for Dylan and me to take sewing classes together. Oh, yeah. And then I looked at it and I was like, wow, this between the two of us will be like a semester at community college financially. So maybe not right now, right? Yeah. But I still thought about it. Then the pandemic came and I would scrap that idea. But like, it is expensive, It is. And it's not just like the education, but like, what's the point of going to class if you don't have a sewing machine at home?
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
Yeah.
No, I totally get that. And I think like when you talk about like, yeah, it's expensive to like learn somewhere, right? Like I think something else that I just want to mention is that like, I think there is a lot of sexism baked into our expectations around sewing. I think there's a lot of devaluing of labor that is traditionally done by women. And so I think we often feel like these things like cooking or childcare or cleaning or sewing, for example, all these things that we sort of have historically viewed as like women's work. Women don't usually get paid for those things. There's this expectation that they just do them for free out of the goodness of their hearts, because that's just like expected, right? And I think there's also kind of this prejudiced view that like learning how to sew shouldn't cost us anything because it's something that like, my grandmother would have taught me for free, or, my mom or, whoever like would just make stuff for us for free. Like there wasn't this expectation of like payment. And I think there's also this sense that like, well, learning the skill should be easy, right? It shouldn't be something that's hard.
It's hard.
It is hard.
It is hard. And, it's not for everyone. Like it's very straining on your eyes.
Yes.
There's a lot of hand-eye coordination involved in it. If you have arthritis or other issues with your hands or your feet and you can't use the pedal, like if you're uncomfortable sitting in a chair, if you have like back issues and like hunching, or, like there's just a million reasons why sewing, not everyone can do it.
Oh, for sure.
And that's okay.
Definitely. And it's like there are some like accessibility modifications that you can make. Like there are sewing machines that, you operate with like a knee pedal or like a hand pedal or something, like if you can't physically like press on a pedal with your foot. And there's different setups that you can get, depending on like if you have certain accessibility needs. But those are pretty, you have to like seek those out. And I think there's just kind of this sense that like, there's kind of a big upfront investment to like getting that all lined up. I don't want people to be discouraged by us saying that it's hard. Like, it is a learnable skill, and I think everything's a learnable skill, and I don't want to just be like, it's hard, don't bother. But I think, like, it's hard, and just go into it with the expectation that it's going to take practice. So yeah, I mean, especially learning how to operate a sewing machine. There's a lot of different kinds of sewing machines. There's a lot of, like, variations and the different kinds you can get if you go to a specific sewing school and they have one certain kind of machine, and then you go to buy a machine. Like, a lot of times people will end up just buying the one that they learned on in the class, because the differences, I mean, they're subtle, and you can totally translate one to the other, but sometimes it feels foreign when you're, like, threading a new machine for the first time.
It's stressful. Threading a new machine for the first time is stressful. The good news is, like, now if you're struggling to thread a machine or anything else related to that, there probably is a YouTube video to help you, which is great. But I remember when I got my first sewing machine as an adult, I got it for Christmas. I remember it cost $100, and I was, like, literally never going to be able to spend $100 on something. So it felt like the most luxurious gift ever. It was a Kenmore, and it was like a sort of mint green. It was so cute. And then I was like, oh my God, I cannot thread this machine. The manual was terrible. It wasn't like, a manual is not how I learn how to do things, basically. And of course, then I couldn't watch a YouTube video to learn. Yeah. And there was, like, a whole afternoon of me just trying to thread this dang thing until I figured it out. But now you don't have that barrier, because someone probably has already made a video to show you how. And so, yes, that first day with your sewing machine at home can be stressful, but it's a lot easier now.
Yeah. Yeah, it totally is. I think, YouTube is incredible. There's all kinds of, great troubleshooting videos out there for, like, is your machine making this noise? Is it this model? And is this particular issue happening? Like, you can really find a lot of, like, very specific information on how to troubleshoot your machine. I will say, something to keep in mind when you're just learning, and I know this is so hard, but I feel like sewing is an ongoing lesson in patience.
Yes.
And even as a professional, like, I sew professionally, I get paid to sew, and I still seam rip stuff all the time. I still sew stuff backwards. I still make mistakes that are silly because I'm not thinking or I'm rushing. And so I think that is something you just have to be prepared to, like, learn over and over again, that like things often unfold a lot more slowly than you're expecting them to, even if it looks super simple, like, oh, it's just this, this, and this. Okay, great. Now my machine tension isn't working, or my bobbin keeps coming unthreaded. Like, there's always going to be something to troubleshoot. And so I don't know. I would advise folks who are going into it to just, like, try to stay optimistic and try to stay curious instead of getting frustrated and giving up. Because the more times you practice correcting your tension or rethreading your bobbin, or, doing a test swatch first, like, on your machine to just make sure that your stitch length is what you want, the more you're also just, like, building that skill of troubleshooting, and the faster that troubleshooting process will get. You're not going to never have to troubleshoot, but, like, you want to get faster at it, and you want to get a little more trusting of yourself that, like, you will be able to get through whatever hurdles come up.
I think that's really good advice, because especially if you are new to sewing and perhaps you got into it because you see people on social media whipping up all these things, it's all cool, you're like, I want to do that too. I get that feeling all the time. I totally understand that. You're not seeing all the times they were there with the stitch ripper, just, like, being so frustrated, right? Or annoyed, or, like, sometimes you're, like, sewing and then your nose starts itching and you just go off on a curve, right? Like, these things just happen. Totally. And that's okay. And I think it's just important to remember that, like, often the version of sewing that we're seeing on social media is this, like, da-da-da-da, here's the thing. Yep. Like, here I am with the fabric. Quick switch.
Oh my
Here's
gosh.
the thing. It's beautiful. I look great. Best day ever.
Yep.
And what you're not seeing is, like, that took time, perhaps weeks. And there were times where that person was like, I'm going to pick up the sewing machine, throw it out the window, or they stab themselves in the finger, or all kinds of things. I have totally been sewing and cut my finger and gotten blood all over what I was sewing.
Yep.
And these are all things that we've experienced, and it's okay. Like, it just, I don't know, it's part of the experience.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think, like, I like to watch those, like, little quippy videos on Instagram as much as the next person, where it's like, here's the fabric, here's the sketch, seam, 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 here it is on me. Like, and it's like, like, I don't know. Yeah, it's like visually appealing to watch that, I think. Like, our brains like it because it's just like, ooh, I got a little like glimpse of this process. But they also, I think it's so important to just like, to stress that like those people are editing so much out. Like, it's also they're good at video editing. That's a whole other skill, right?
That is, right?
Being a good video editor and a good videographer is a completely separate skill from being good at sewing. So there's a lot of people who are good at sewing. You're never going to see their projects displayed in that format because that is also just like, as a sewist, I often forget to film what I'm making as I'm making it. And then I'll be like 3 stitches from the end and be like, oh, whoops, I should have like made a cute little video about this.
Right.
But then I'm like, I don't know. Do people need to see that? Like, is it maybe almost unintentionally more discouraging for people to just see like me, like only the highlights of like me putting together this thing? Like,
I mean, I don't know. Because you're like, that's a good question. Because on one hand, you don't want to bore people or turn them off of, discourage them from sewing, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, the vast majority of people out there still think that our clothes are made by machines and robots and that it's really easy and therefore clothes should be really cheap.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think the best, seriously, for anything that you've ever seen that you were like, why does that cost that much?
Yeah.
Literally the best thing you can do is like sit down and make it yourself. Like, I mean, from like making pesto by yourself and being like, oh my God, this is like, I need so much basil. I need so many nuts. Like,
so much
of course,
basil.
that's why pesto is expensive, right? Or like sewing your own clothes and being like, oh my gosh, how could a dress be $5 when it took me all this time? But these are like good things for us to learn. And I do think that one of the ways fast fashion has been able to just get away with selling us crappy stuff using a supply chain based on exploitation is that none of us, the vast majority of us don't know how to sew.
Yeah.
And so we don't know that you just like, I'm telling you that there are people who think that like the machine does the sewing for you. But that's not true, right? It's like a tool. It's like if I use a drill to hang a photo on the wall, you're not like, oh, the drill did it for you, right? It's a tool that helped me do it, right?
Exactly.
And I think that we need to like remember that like it's just like scissors. Scissors don't just magically do work for you. You have to be there operating them.
Absolutely.
So is sewing. And I do think beyond even the sustainability wins of us sewing our clothing or at the very least repairing it when we can, right? Those are huge wins right there. The simplest win is being like, oh, wow, sewing clothes is like hard and skilled, right? And maybe clothes shouldn't be that cheap, right? I think that's a major win
Totally.
too. But with nobody knowing how to make clothes, you're like, how much time could it take to make a shirt?
Yeah.
I just watched an Instagram reel and it took 30 seconds.
Right?
Right?
Those time lapses, man.
Yeah, exactly. And so like that's when I'm like, oh, maybe someone should have to sit down and watch you sew a garment from beginning to end. I know.
It's like slow TV where they follow the train, right? Like
yeah, right. It's not like, and the thing about sewing is you can't also be like, I'm going to put on a movie while I do it.
No,
you know? It's
no.
like so
I mean,
focused.
Some people do. I don't know how anybody does it. I have some friends that will like have Netflix playing, but I'm the kind of person like when I watch TV, like it, like whatever I'm doing, like needs my full attention. I cannot split my attention or I make mistakes.
Right.
I do listen to podcasts though. I listen to Clotheshorse a lot when I'm sewing.
It seems
actually,
like Clotheshorse is popular for sewing. Yeah, I can do a podcast when I'm doing things like that, but I couldn't be like, and I'm also texting and I'm also watching a movie. And, you know, like, whereas if I'm watching a movie, I'm probably doing 35 other things. One of them is definitely not sewing unless it's hand sewing. And so, yeah, I do think, I mean, I think that there's this belief that you like put the fabric on the machine, you press on, you kick back, light up a cigarette, and just wait for it to finish.
Yeah,
you know?
I wish.
I know. And so I do think it's important to talk about the skill and the time required in sewing. And for all of you who do sew your own stuff, like seriously show people that and brag about it and talk about the work involved in it, because we take that information for granted and we shouldn't, because most people do not know it.
Yeah. Oh, totally. So I have kind of a funny story along these lines. So I teach private sewing lessons. I do I offer it on a much more limited basis now than I used to, but maybe like, I don't know, 10 years ago at this point, when I lived in New York City, I had a little like freelance side hustle called Sewing Lessons NYC, and I would teach people I would give people one-on-one private sewing lessons like in their homes. And I had one student who had like a beloved shirt. It was like a button-down shirt from like Express or like the Limited or something. And she loved it. And she was like, I really want to recreate this shirt. Is this something we can do in sewing lessons? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. But okay, keep in mind a button-down shirt has like quite a few pieces. So it's not like a t-shirt where it's just like front, back, and sleeve.
This is hard.
It's like,
I'm already like
we
buttonholes.
We got buttonholes. We got sleeves with like cuffs. We got a vent in the sleeve. We have a collar and a collar stand. We have a center front placket. We have, like the two front pieces are a little bit different because the placket is a little bit different in terms of depending on which one goes over the top. Anyway, whatever. Needless to say, this is kind of a complicated project. So not only does she want to like fully trace off this shirt, she's going to trace it off, make a pattern from it, cut the pattern out of fabric, sew this thing out completely herself, right? And this shirt probably cost her like $40. It's not something that is like, so I think we start the project and it becomes clear like 2 or 3 lessons in that this is going to be like a months long project. And it was really interesting because I could kind of see that play out, like that realization of like, holy crap, this is so much more work than I thought it was going to be. And we stuck with it. And at the end, like she had a shirt that was like basically the exact, clone of her former shirt. But if you think about, all of the time we spent, also, she was paying me for these lessons. So like it was probably close to like $1,000, maybe more over the course of like several months that we worked on this shirt together. But that's like just the reality of how long that process takes when you've never done it before. You don't have like a baseline skill set. You're learning how to do everything new for the first time. I think it was just like a really kind of interesting realization of like, oh, this is complex. This thing that I bought for $40 is the culmination of all of these different skills and all of these different steps. And there's so many steps. And it does make you think like, well, how can that be $40? Even if all of these processes are like industrialized and we're mass producing them and we're not cutting out each shirt one at a time, but maybe we're cutting out like a huge stack of them at once. It's like they still need to be sewn together like by hand, by a person, by like actual hands on a sewing machine. And like your seams still need to be pressed open. And like, these are not automated processes. These are things that are being done by people in a factory. And like, yes, it's more efficient to sort of have this assembly line model where maybe one person is like only sewing the collars and one person is like only doing the buttonholes. But that still means like there's somebody there operating those machines at every step of the process.
Yeah. I mean, unlike a lot of things that we can buy, like consumer goods, like clothing has not been fully automated. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
You need the hands
totally
to do it, right? Yeah. So, okay. So we know that, like sewing is going to take some time and it's not like the skills, I don't know, the education around it are not always accessible to other people. What are some other barriers to sewing for people?
Yeah, so we did talk about this a little bit before, but I think, talking about how much space it takes up and how much space you have access to, like I am really, really lucky that I now have a studio outside of my home that I rent in a studio building and I share it with another artist, but I'm able to have like a permanently set up large cutting table that's at like a nice counter height. I've like never had that before in my career.
It's luxurious for
and
sure.
I've been doing this professionally for like 15 years.
Yeah.
So
wow.
It's definitely something where like, I think people will often take a class somewhere that is like set up with all of that studio equipment. And then they get home and they're like, how do I recreate this?
Right. Yeah.
Like, most people don't, if you have a large table that it's big enough for you to like lay out fabric, it's probably like your dining room table or your kitchen table. Exactly. Or maybe you'll get like a folding table. This is a fun hack, but I've actually seen a lot of people getting secondhand ping pong tables to use for crafting because they fold up really nicely and they're like a nice height and a nice width. So if you're looking for like a temporary setup cutting table, check your local Facebook Marketplace for ping pong tables.
Such a good idea. Such a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's like a really clever hack and I love to see it. But anyway, yeah, it just like, it takes up a lot of space. So there's definitely like the aspect of like cutting out fabric. Like you want to be able to lay your fabric out flat, and fabric is usually between like 40 to 60 inches wide. And most garments are probably going to take like 2 to 3 yards of fabric. So if you think about like what that actual measurement is, a yard is 36 inches. You probably want a table that's like 72 inches long at least.
Which a lot of apartments don't have.
Yeah, totally. And then width-wise, you want to be able to, lay your fabric out flat or fold it in half. And even if you're folding it in half, if your fabric is 60 inches wide, that's 30 inches from end to end when it's folded. So again, you're looking for like a pretty big table surface. Also like ergonomically, ideally, if you're cutting out a lot, you probably want something that's at like a counter height. If you're working on something lower, like a dining room table, it might be kind of hard on your back after a while because you're bending down quite a bit. I used to cut out all my fabric on the floor, which is great for your knees and back.
Makes my back hurt thinking about it. Yeah.
Probably one of the reasons I have like chronic back problems now. I actually used to live in Brooklyn, and my sewing studio was literally just like a 4-foot square corner of my bedroom. And when I had to cut out fabric, I had this large cardboard cutting mat that I would actually put on my bed. So I would lay it out on my bed. I would lay the fabric on top of the cardboard and then cut on top of the cardboard. So it was very hard to kind of like live around a project. Like I had to kind of cut stuff out all at once and then kind of pile it up in the corner because I had to go to sleep at night, and you can't like sleep under a bunch of half cut out fabric. So having like the right space, to work with all of those materials, I think that's a barrier because we're also like living in smaller and smaller apartments. Like rent is getting more expensive. If you live in a big city and you like share an apartment with roommates or something, like they probably don't want your like half sewn sewing project taking up whatever counter or table space you have for like weeks at a time. So that becomes something that you have to negotiate. Another funny story, so when I was sewing out of my bedroom in Brooklyn all those years ago, I actually got this gig where I was altering Power Rangers suits for the New York City Toy Fair.
Fun.
Yeah, so I had, there were 5 stunt doubles that were going to be performing at the New York City Toy Fair wearing official, like, Saban Power Ranger suits. It was, like, the actual company that makes Power Rangers, like, was, like, doing this performance. So I had these 5 large Tupperware bins. Each one had like a costume in it, and they brought it to my house because that was where my studio was. It was like in my bedroom. And so I had these 5 giant bins like piled up on the side of my bedroom. And then I had these appointments where total strangers would come to my studio, which was essentially my bedroom, in an apartment that I shared with a couple who were like definitely like, sitting on the couch like while these people were coming over, which was like just awkward and weird. And so like these people would come over. I'd be like, cool, come onto my studio. And I like put this like folding screen up in front of my bed to try to make it look less like I live here. And I like did these alterations. They were like in my actual bathroom, like trying on these like Power Ranger, like unitard things with all these like armor components. It was very silly. But yeah. And so these 5 people like came and just like hung out in my bedroom while I altered their Power Rangers costumes.
But there's a will, there's a way, I guess.
Exactly. But I just like, I share that just to say that like you can even be like a professional in this industry and it's still really hard to find enough space. It's just like, it's an affordability factor. Like in Brooklyn, I never could have afforded a studio outside of my house. So I just had to make do with what I had.
No, totally. So. I remember like at one point when Dylan and I were living in Portland, when Dylan was particularly young, at that point it was still like crazy affordable to live there, which is why we live there. Like I was like, this is literally the best place and time for me to be a very low income single parent. Like I can get around on my bike and rent is affordable. And we lived in a 2-bedroom place for $530 a month. I mean, imagine, right? I know.
I don't think my rent has ever been that low.
Before that, we had been living in like a studio apartment. Well, it was a 1-bedroom, but like Dylan slept in the bedroom and I slept on the couch, and like there was no sewing to be done there ever, period, right? We didn't even have a table.
Yeah.
But when we moved into this 2-bedroom place where everybody had their own room, I would seriously be like, okay, I'm going to put my sewing machine on my dresser and kind of like sort of stand at it. And cut things out and stuff on my bed. And like, that was just the best we could do. And once again, like very little sewing happening in this situation, more just like alterations and stuff because, you know, like there was no time. But these are real barriers.
Totally.
And so I think that's really important to call out too. But the other barrier I think that is really important, we've already talked about like how a sewing machine can be expensive, difficult to find. Fabric is more expensive than you think. And it really points to how, once again, the clothing prices that we see right now are such an illusion. Right? So let's talk about that a little bit.
Oh my gosh, totally. So, okay. So yeah, fabric prices will kind of blow your mind if you've never shopped for fabric before.
They will.
There is like a wide range of fabric prices. So like, and I think there is sometimes also some pressure from the sewing community or maybe even internally where we're like, I want to use all natural fibers. I want to use all like really nice materials. I don't want to use polyester. I don't want to use anything with stretch, right? And it's like basically like the more organic and sustainable and natural your fibers are, the more expensive the fabric is going to be.
True story.
I think, if you think about, how many yards of fabric one garment takes. Like, let's say you're going to make a dress. That could take anywhere from like 2 to 4 yards of fabric, maybe more. If it's got a really full skirt, maybe it's going to be like 6 yards. And fabric can range anywhere from like, $1 to $4 a yard on the very, very cheap end to like $50 a yard and more on the more expensive end. I have looked at websites where it's like, okay, this is like this really beautiful, like all organic, like linen, check plaid in gorgeous colors. And it's like $60 a yard. And then you think, okay, so I need 4 yards of that. And it's like, okay. So like, do I want to spend like $240 on fabric that I then have to cut out and sew for this one garment? Like it becomes,
it's real.
It quickly surpasses the price of like most ready to wear, unless you're buying exclusively like luxury and high end stuff. But a lot of times, like even if you're just using cheap fabric, even if you're going to use like the $4 a yard fabric, and let's say you need 4 yards, that's still $16. And like, sadly, you can buy a dress for $16 these days.
I know, I hate it. You could buy
just
3.
like already made. I know.
I know.
And so it's like, it becomes this justification of like I feel like there is this point, there's like a point where it's like, you have to want it. You have to be like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to commit to doing this. And yeah, I mean, and that's only the cost of materials too. So, I mean, sometimes it's not just fabric, but sometimes for certain garments, you might need zippers, you might need buttons, you might need interfacing, which is like a fabric that kind of gets fused to the inside, or sometimes it just gets sewn to the inside, but it makes certain parts of the garment a little bit stiffer. So if you're making things with like collars or cuffs or certain details where maybe like a little bit more body or stiffness is needed, you're probably going to need interfacing. You might need lining fabric if you're making a coat or something. And so all of those other aspects, which we sometimes call notions, those can add up as well. And you're going to probably also want matching thread. So it quickly becomes like an investment to get all of the supplies for just one project or one material. And I think, kind of sadly, a lot of people do that calculation or start to do that calculation and just kind of decide like it isn't worth it.
Right. Right. No, I think, and I get that. Right. Once again, like here, we're also talking about an investment of time here. It's just a lot. And then, all this stuff, you're like, these clothing prices don't make sense at all. I remember the first time I bought fabric for a project and I was like, whoa, wait, how much? And then I was like, well, like the fashion companies that do like, huge runs of styles, like they get lower pricing on fabric. Okay, maybe that makes sense, blah, blah, blah. But I will tell you, as a person who's worked in this industry for so long now, I want to assure you once again that like the pricing of clothing that we're offered right now is an illusion that is just based on nothing being what it seems.
Totally.
At all. Yeah.
Totally. I think I kind of gained the most insight into that when I so there's a textile recycling organization called Fab Scrap that's based in New York. They we're in Philly. Their Philly location just closed, RIP.
So sad.
I'm really sad about. But you could like volunteer to sort through textile waste there. And a lot of it is like production room samples and swatches and stuff. So it's all stuff that's like pre-consumer. So it's not, it's not clothing that people have worn yet, but it's like stuff that was part of the design process. That they are like recycling through fab scrap. So part of that is you're like sorting stuff. And a lot of times you'll get like these swatch cards and there will be the wholesale pricing for those textiles on the swatch cards. And it's very interesting. You don't always know like what company they're from or anything, but it's very interesting to be like, oh, okay, this is like a cotton linen blend. And, the factory pricing on this is like $10 a yard or $5 a yard or something. And sometimes it is a lot lower than you would pay as a consumer, kind of like buying a couple yards off the bolt. Because if you think about it, the company is probably going to order it directly from the mill. They're going to have it made specifically for them, but they also get a discount for ordering like giant quantities of this stuff. So, maybe they're going to order like 10,000 yards or something. So like, yeah, $3 to $5 a yard maybe is reasonable. Whereas like if you were just going to go buy that same fabric in a store, you might pay like $15 a yard for it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just like kind of an important perspective to keep in mind of like one of the reasons. And I do think there's also a lot of like unethical pressuring of like textile mills to like do stuff cheaper and cheaper.
Oh, yeah,
and like,
for sure.
I'm sure there are like bills that don't get paid and people who get, who never get their paychecks and everything. But yeah, I mean, it is going to be more expensive especially if you're buying new fabric, to buy it by the yard than sort of like in bulk from a mill. There are a lot of good ways, though, that I can, some ways that I can offer to look for fabric that is less expensive.
Yeah.
So there are fabric stores that are called, in the industry, they're called jobbers. Mm-hmm. And those are places that sell primarily what's called deadstock, which means it's usually like extra stuff that mills produced or that factories had left over at the end of a production run. And these companies will buy up all of those sort of ends of bolts and sell them to consumers for often way more lower and reasonable prices than like new fabric. So in Philadelphia, there's a lovely store called Jomar.
I knew you were going to say it. Jomar.
Love Jomar.
I know. It's so weird there.
Oh, it's very strange.
Yeah,
it's very strange. But I would say, if you're in the Philadelphia area and you are looking for, like, I would say Jomar is like kind of the premier jobber in this region.
And they have great place for fabric. They also have like so much other weird stuff there.
They do. Housewares, clothing, shoes, handbags.
I wish we could go there today.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, someday.
Yeah,
it's an adventure for sure. Give yourself a couple hours if you're going to go there. Something to keep in mind with shopping from a jobber is that a lot of times stuff isn't labeled. You don't really know what the fiber content is. You don't really know what the origin of stuff is. And it can be kind of hard to know like what you're buying, but often the price is so much lower that it's sort of like, you're sort of taking a risk on the purchase. If you, want to experiment, there is like something where you can do what's called burn testing to kind of figure out what the fiber content might be of fabric, where you would usually take like a swatch, very carefully light it on fire. I usually do it with tweezers over the sink, just in case.
Good call.
Metal tweezers. Just like light the edge with a lighter and kind of see how it burns. And usually if it gets really like thick and sticky and melty and like bubbly, it's made of plastic, like it's polyester or nylon or something synthetic. If it smells kind of like burning paper and it creates sort of like a whitish ash, like almost like your campfire, it's probably a cellulosic fiber, which means something that comes from a plant, which would be something like cotton or linen, rayon also, and like bamboo, like those are also produced from cellulosic fibers. So those will kind of burn similarly. If it's wool, wool is actually like a natural fire retardant.
Which is amazing.
Which is crazy. So if you light wool on fire, it actually usually will just sort of like sizzle and crisp at the end and the fire will sort of self-extinguish. And you'll get that like burning hair smell. So if you're shopping at a place like Jomar, I mean, don't like burn test in the store because that's incredibly dangerous.
And rude.
Yes. But you can always ask, like, can I have a swatch of this? And then you can like take it home with you or like take it out into the parking lot and like very safely, just do a very, very small piece and kind of see what happens. And that can at least, it's not going to tell you exactly what the fiber is. Like, you might not be 100, like, okay, is this 100% cotton? I don't know. But it gives you a sense of like, okay, is this going to be something that's like breathable like a cotton, or is it like melty, sticky polyester? So that can be a helpful way to shop from those kinds of places and have at least like a little bit of insight into what you're buying. There are also actually like surprisingly Mood fabrics in New York City, and I think they've got one in LA too, which is kind of like a world famous fabric store. They're also a jobber, but they're kind of a more high-end jobber. So you'll notice if you ever shop at Mood, a lot of the tags will be labeled with like even sometimes the factory that it came from. Like it'll be like, oh, this is like Jill Sander, like fall 2022 or something. And it's kind of interesting to be like, oh, okay, like I know what this is, like exactly what this is, and you can actually buy that fabric from that designer's collection that may have even been custom milled for them. So that's kind of cool. And Mood is really good about labeling their fiber content and telling you like the origin of things and like what things are. So another really great place to look for like secondhand or like cheaper textiles is like creative reuse centers.
Yeah. Ours here in Lancaster has so much fabric. Now, with, whether it's like deadstock fabric or creative reuse fabric, sometimes you're going to be limited by availability, right?
Totally.
Like you want to make sure that you have enough fabric to do your project. I have learned that lesson the hard way. That's why I'm calling it out.
Yeah.
Where I was just like caught up in the moment. So definitely like be sure you know how much you're buying. Here in Lancaster, they do such a great job of the creative reuse of labeling how much fabric there is. And I really appreciate that. But there's so much fabric at these places.
There is.
So much.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think we have one in Philadelphia called the Resource Exchange, and it's like their selection is ever changing. So I think it's a great place to go if you sort of have like have a project in mind, but maybe aren't being super specific about like your color or your fiber content or your fabric weight. Like it's a great place to kind of go and see what they have. But if you're going in being like, I need a 40-ounce bull denim in indigo with this specific selvage, it's like you're probably not going to find that. But if you're like, hey, I'm going to make an apron and I'm just kind of looking for like a cute cotton print, like that's probably definitely something you could find at a place like that. However, if you're not looking for that bull denim, you're probably going to find it.
That's the
you're
rule.
more likely to find it.
Yeah.
If you haven't decided you wanted it yet, it might be there.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so those can be great places to look. Also, estate sales. This is kind of a weird one. Estate sales and yard sales. A lot of times, like, folks will pass away, or maybe they're downsizing or moving, and they'll have, like, I think fabric is one of those things, once you get into sewing, a lot of us tend to just collect a lot of it.
Yes.
I'm totally guilty of this myself. I've done like maybe 3 major fabric purges in my professional life when I've like moved studios, and somehow it all just accumulates back within like a year. But yeah, people who are in these, who, are part of these like creative hobbies and these creative communities, like often have like an excess of supplies. And so a lot of times people are getting rid of stuff at like yard sales or estate sales, and that can sometimes be like the cheapest place to find stuff because people just want to get rid of it. And sometimes they'll even give it away. Like there's even sometimes there'll be like fabric swap events that might be hosted by a local sewing school or a reuse center or at like a church or a specific, type of community. Fabric swaps, I think, are becoming more common. There's also like the whole like de-stash movement. So there's like de-stash channels that might be like, like a Facebook group or something. It might be specific to your craft. Like maybe it's quilting, maybe it's apparel fabrics, maybe it's home decor fabrics. But a lot of times people who do kind of tend to collect fabric, it's like I feel very willing to part with stuff as long as somebody is like, I'm definitely going to use this.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Like I think sometimes it's nice to get rid of it because like we just kind of want to see it get used. I inherited a lot of fabric from my late aunt who was a textile artist, and when she passed away, I basically like got her sewing machine and her thread and like a whole bunch of fabric. And it's kind of funny because like I still have a lot of it, but I have sewn with a lot of it. And I often think of her when I'm wearing those garments. And so it's like a kind of nice, it can be like a nice way to like be connected and like be a part of this community. And I often think like, man, she would be really happy that somebody like finally made something with that.
Yeah.
Like actually the blouse I'm wearing right now is fabric from her stash. So this little floral, you can't see
really
it, but
cute.
It's like a rayon print with these like kind of geometric, like bright fuchsia flower designs.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So there's probably, there might even be people in your family or in your community, in your neighborhood that have a ton of extra stuff that they'd be willing to part with for, a home-cooked meal or even just the promise that you'll use it.
Exactly. Because so much of this fabric just sits in people's closets. I mean, I agree. I see so much of it at estate sales. Out here where I live, people are less likely to do an estate sale and more likely to do an auction. It's like the same kind of thing. Okay. All the sewing supplies that you would ever need. Or if you're like, I need a ton of yarn and different needles, like all the things for sure. And out here with so many of the thrift stores being run by the Mennonites, like they always have a huge fabric section and they're usually really well labeled and sorted. There's a lot of secondhand fabric out there. So don't let the sticker shock of fabric stores deter you, because what you'll find actually, this is just my experience with my friends and whatnot, I'm not speaking for everyone ever, but is that the people who sew the most actually go to fabric stores the least.
Yeah.
Right?
Kind of true.
Yeah, because fabric comes your way in all these other ways. So just That's true. Something to keep in mind. And like also, I mean, real talk, there are less and less fabric stores, right? Now I'm lucky where I live because there's so much quilting happening out here, and because the Amish and the Mennonite population still sew their clothes and like don't go online. There are lots of locally run fabric stores here, but that is not the case. And most places I've lived, you either had an option of like a fancy schmancy fabric store or Joann.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I know like Joann Fabrics and like Michael's Craft Store, like those kinds of places, like Hobby Lobby, like those, kind of came in like probably the like late 90s, early aughts, and like a lot of smaller craft stores and like smaller fabric stores like really didn't survive with that competition, which is really sad. Because I often feel like, I mean, if Joann Fabrics is all you have in your area, like you can go there, but I've noticed a lot of times the pricing at Joann's is way higher than what I would pay at a local fabric store. A lot of their apparel fabrics are like $15 to $25 a yard, which is kind of insane. Like that's just so... it's really inflated. And the reason they're doing that is because they also have a ton of coupons. So they want to like encourage you to like shop regularly and like build up points and get use the coupons for stuff. Yeah. So they're basically pricing stuff high enough so that if somebody uses like a 40% off coupon, they're still scooping a profit. So just keep that in mind. Yeah, before you pay $25 a yard for like denim or something at Joann's.
Get a coupon.
Hold out for the coupons.
Yeah. No, Joann is one of those places where, like, I would say when I think about companies that are really manipulating people via discounts, it's Joann's, Kohl's, and Michael's, where it's like nothing. Oh, and RIP Bed Bath & Beyond.
Yeah.
But where like everything is priced up a ton because they assume you're going to use a coupon, and then it will be like an average price. And one example I have that has nothing to do with fabric is I specifically remember being like, you know what? We're going to get a soda stream. Okay. And I was like, cause we drink so much sparkling water and there's all these cans and blah, blah, blah. Like we're going to get a soda stream. My friend Kim had one and she was like, oh, it saves me so much waste, blah, blah, blah. So went on the internet to look at soda streams and I was like, oh, Bed Bath & Beyond has it. Oh, for some reason, the same soda stream is like $35 more at Bed Bath & Beyond than anywhere else. Oh, why? Because when you use the coupon that you can get for signing up, it's then the same price as every other place. Hate it.
It's a little scammy. You gotta be careful. So one thing that I think is important is when you do buy fabric, before you cut into it, you always want to pre-wash it, even if it's secondhand, because a lot of times fabric will shrink in the washing machine. So I've made many things where I was impatient and didn't pre-wash something, and then I made a whole garment out of it, put a ton of time into it, and then I put it in the washing machine and it came out like a size smaller.
And it never fit.
Yeah.
I think many people have made that mistake.
Yeah. So if you're new to sewing and you've never, done this before, pre-wash your fabric. I also suggest if you have a dryer, throw it in the dryer, even if you never plan to dry it ever in your life, just in case you accidentally someday throw it in, or your spouse or your housemate or your kid just like throws it in the dryer by mistake. It won't totally ruin the fabric. Like, you will have already sort of like shrunk it as much as it can possibly shrink from the heat. So that's just like a good thing to keep in mind. And then also I get asked this a lot by like people who are new to sewing, or like new, especially for clothing. People will say, like, if I'm out at a store and I'm looking around and I'm thinking, like, I just want to buy something, like, I don't really have a project in mind for it yet, but like, I'm in love with this print. It's so good. I'm never going to see it again. It's dead stock. How much of it should I buy? And I think this is a really great question. And my suggestion is between 2 to 4 yards.
Okay.
Because I think if you just get 1 yard, that's very limiting in terms of what you can make with it. You're basically looking at like a tank top or a throw pillow or something kind of small. Not even jams.
Not even jams.
Yeah. If you wear a larger size, like if you consider yourself in the plus size category, you might want to err on the side of like 3 yards, just because sometimes pattern pieces are wider and they take up a little more space on the fabric. But I would say most things that are like kind of simple tops or pants or dresses are going to take something in that 2 to 4 yard category. If it's something that's got a lot of ruffles, a lot of decorative, bits and extra pieces, maybe you want 5 or 6 yards. But if you're just like, hey, I'm at an estate sale and they have all these great fabrics and I just want to know, like, how much should I buy to be covered for like a medium-sized project? My answer is 2 to 4 yards. So,
okay.
Thank you.
That's good. No, I think that's really good advice, because I definitely have been like, 1 yard, I'm going to get so much use out of this. And then it's like still sitting in my closet because I'm like, I guess I'm going to make a pouch out of it. Like, So definitely something to be mindful of, and certainly there are creative challenges to be found with a bunch of smaller quantities of fabric, for sure. We're not saying you shouldn't, whatever, but yeah, very, very good advice that beginners especially often learn the hard way.
Totally.
If you're enjoying this episode, then this is a great time to remind you that my work here at Clotheshorse is made possible by the support of listeners like you, just like NPR, and these great small businesses. Please go give them your support. Blank Cass, or Blanket Coats by Cass, is focused on restoring, renewing, and reviving the history held within vintage and heirloom textiles. By embodying the love, craft, and energy that is original to each vintage textile as I transfer it into a new garment, I hope we can reteach ourselves to care for and mend what we have and make it last. Blank Cass lives on Instagram at _Cass, and a website will be launched soon at blankcass.com. Located in Whistler, Canada, Velvet Underground is a velvet jungle full of vintage and secondhand clothing, plants, a vegan cafe, and lots of rad products from other small sustainable businesses. Our mission is to create a brand and community dedicated to promoting self-expression, as well as educating and inspiring a more sustainable and conscious lifestyle, both for the people and the planet. Find us on Instagram at shop_Velvet Underground, or online at www.shopvelvetunderground.com. St. Evens is a New York City-based vintage shop that is dedicated to bringing you those special pieces you'll reach for again and again. More than just a store, St. Evens is dedicated to sharing the stories and history behind the garments. 10% of all sales are donated to a different charitable organization each month. New vintage is released every Thursday at wearstevens.com, with previews of new pieces and more, brought to you on Instagram at wear_st.evens. That's Wear St. Evens. Country Feedback is a mom and pop record shop in Tarboro, North Carolina. They specialize in used rock, country, and soul and offer affordable vintage clothing and housewares. Do you have used records you want to sell? Country Feedback wants to buy them. Find us on Instagram at Country Feedback Vintage and Vinyl, or head down east and visit our brick and mortar. All are welcome at this inclusive and family-friendly record shop in the country. Republica Unicornia Yarns. Handmade yarn and notions for the color obsessed. Made with love and some swearing in fabulous Atlanta, Georgia by head yarn wench Kathleen. Get ready for rainbows with a side of giving a damn. Republica Unicornia is all about making your own magic using small batch, responsibly sourced, hand-dyed yarns and thoughtfully made notions. Slow fashion all the way down and discover the joy of creating your very own beautiful hand-knit, crocheted, or woven pieces. Find us on Instagram at Republica_Unicornia_yarns and at www.republicaunicornia.com. Picnic Wear, a slow fashion brand ethically made by hand from vintage and deadstock materials, most notably vintage towels. Founder Danny has worked in the industry as a fashion designer for over 10 years, but started Picnic Wear in response to her dissatisfaction with the industry's shortcomings. Picnic Wear recently moved to rural North Carolina, where all their sewing and accessories are now designed and cut, but the majority of their sewing is done by skilled garment workers in New York City. Their customers take comfort in knowing that all their sewists are paid well above New York City minimum wage. Picnic Wear offers minimal waste and maximum authenticity. Future vintage over future garbage. Cute Little Ruin is an online shop dedicated to providing quality vintage and secondhand clothing, vinyl, and home items in a wide range of styles and price points. If it's ethical and legal, we try to find a home for it. Vintage style with progressive values. Find us on Instagram at Cute Little Ruin. Is there a little bit of Italy in your soul? Are you an enthusiast of pre-loved decor and accessories? Bring vintage Italian style and history into your space with the pewter thimble. We source useful and beautiful things and mend them where needed. We also find gorgeous illustrations and make them print-worthy. Tarot cards, tea towels, and hand-picked treasures available to you from the comfort of your own home. Responsibly sourced from across Rome, lovingly renewed by fairly paid artists and artisans, with something for every budget. Discover more at thepewterthimble.com. Deco Denim is a startup based out of San Francisco, and it sells clothing and accessories that are sustainable, gender fluid, size inclusive, and high quality, made to last for years to come. Deco Denim is trying to change the way you think about buying clothes. Founder Sarah Mattis wants to empower people to ask important questions like, where was this made? Was this garment made ethically? Is this fabric made of plastic? Can this garment be upcycled? And if not, can it be recycled? Sign up at decodenim.com to receive $20 off your first purchase. They promise not to spam you and send out no more than 3 emails a month, with 2 of them surrounding education or a personal note from the founder. Again, that's decodenim.com. We talked about how sewing is expensive, it's hard, it takes a long time, you might not have the space. We could be pretty discouraging here. So,
Yeah.
Ruby, tell us why people should consider or would enjoy or want to sew their own clothing.
Yeah, great question. I know. I really hope we haven't discouraged folks from it.
I hope not. I don't think we have. Yeah.
So I will say once you develop a kind of a baseline skill set, it's very fulfilling to sew your own clothes. I think the reason that so many people love posting their makes on Instagram or making those cute little videos of projects coming together is that it's so satisfying to have something that you made and wear it on your body. It really feels like this statement of autonomy and self-determination. I think that's why I got into sewing and fashion as a teenager. I was at an age where I was kind of experiencing a lot of body dysmorphia, and I kind of felt like I didn't really like know myself or have control over my image or how I was perceived, especially as like a curvier kid, like in high school, like you get a lot of kind of unwanted attention from people. People kind of like sexualizing your body, and this like felt like a way to sort of reclaim some autonomy and be like, no, I'm choosing how I present myself to the world. And I have total control over everything that I'm like putting on my body and how it looks. So I think that is like a really magical thing that, people can gain a lot from, just like psychologically, in terms of like confidence and feeling at home in your body and feeling like you're looking like the version of yourself in your head that you want to look like. I think it also gives you a different relationship to the clothes in your closet. I know like the stuff I have that I've made for myself, which at this point is like quite a bit. It's definitely not everything in my closet, but it's maybe like 30%, but like I treasure those garments so much more than anything I bought from a store. Like I will go out of my way to take really good care of them. I will go out of my way to like repair them or remove a stain. They just feel so much more precious to me because I know how much work I put into them, and it feels like I have a relationship with that garment instead of it just being like, oh, like I needed a black cardigan from Old Navy, so I bought a black cardigan from Old Navy, and then the sleeve ripped, and I'm just going to throw it out and buy another black cardigan from Old Navy, So like there's kind of this like sentimental value, I think, that gets attached to the pieces that you made for yourself. And also similarly, like if you're making clothes for other people in your family too, like I have some pieces, not sewn stuff, but I have like some scarves and stuff that were hand knit by my aunt, who is a fiber artist. And it's like, I treasure those. I will never get rid of them because they're so special to me. Because it feels like a connection, like with somebody who's passed. So I think that is another kind of really wonderful, like meaningful aspect to it. Yeah, it's like you kind of understand how much work went into it, and you understand like this has a connection to a person. Not that our store-bought clothes don't have connections to people, but it's made so invisible,
Yeah, the humans are sort of erased from it.
Totally. Yeah. So like there could have been like a really sweet grandma who like sewed that Old Navy cardigan, right? But like I don't know her. We're not supposed to talk about her. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's just, like we talk about wanting to have sort of this like more wholesome connection to our food, right? Like some people will go out of their way to like shop at the local farmer's market, or maybe you'll go out of your way to like hire a local artist or artisan to do certain things. And I think like with clothing, it's like a similar thing where you're just saying like, this is an aspect of my life where I want to feel connected to this thing. And I want to feel like rooted in it, and I want to feel like I have autonomy over it, and it's something that I'm choosing instead of just something that is like happening to me, like the circumstances around me.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's really important. What about like the creative side of that?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the most wonderful parts of starting to sew your own clothes. I think a lot of the clothes that are out there nowadays are kind of boring, like a lot of ready to wear, because they're just cutting corners wherever they can. Like anything that's interesting gets cut. When I was in college and at fashion school, I actually did an internship in the swimwear department at Sears and Kmart.
Whoa.
The design. Sorry, swimwear design. It was like the design department.
I mean, I have so many memories as a kid of getting my swimsuit every year at Kmart. Just saying.
Yeah, and it was wild. I mean, I think that was like that was kind of the only time that I worked in like corporate fast fashion, but it was so interesting because we would have these design meetings, and it was like all the people that worked there in design clearly wanted these bathing suits to be kind of cool and like kind of cute.
That's the thing. No one's like, oh, you know what we should do is make something really stupid that everyone hates and no one that fits no one and breaks on the first wear. That's the saddest part of it all. I know.
It is. And so people would, the designers there like would design these like really kind of cute collections that were like a lot of stuff for like teens and tweens. And then we'd be in the design meeting and they'd be like, oh, sorry, you have those like plastic pony beads like on the bikini ties. Those are like 5 cents each, so we're gonna cut those.
I've been there, by the way, everyone. Like, this is an experience I know way too well. When you said plastic pony beads, I immediately were like, they're getting cut.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And it's like the cheapest. It was like, it was like the bare minimum thing you could add to this bathing suit to make it like at all cool or interesting. And it was like, no, can't do it. They were like, this needs to retail for $12. So like, no, we can't have the 5 cent pony beads on the bikini ties. Just like, come on. But yeah, so, I think like that, but that's happening kind of universally across the board at like a lot of fashion companies where they're saying like, lose a button here, lose a pocket here, like reduce this cool top stitching detail because that's going to cost a little bit of extra. And so the thing when you're making your own clothes is it's like, you're not mass producing this. You can decide how much time you want to put into it. For you to slip a 5-cent plastic pony bead onto your self-made bikini, like who cares? You can put 10 pony beads.
Yeah.
You can make the whole thing in beads.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's like, to me, the fact that you can actually achieve the full vision that you were imagining is incredible, because I'm sure you've had this experience too where you're like thinking about what you're going to wear for like an event or just in general, and you have this vision of the outfit, and then what you actually are able to buy is like this watered down version of it. And so as we are recording this today, earlier this week, I did a talk for like an event in Berlin for fashion changers about AI and fashion, which I'm going to turn into a whole episode because the research was really fascinating. But one thing I want to tell you all that I'll go into more in this future episode is that more and more brands, this is going to really grind your gears, Ruby, so get ready. More and more brands are using AI now to just completely design the clothing. So rather than a designer saying like, I have this vision of this bathing suit and there's these pony beads and it's going to be so sick, right? They're not sitting down and sketching that out or pulling these ideas from their brain. Not that they don't want to, not that they don't have the skill to do it or the talent. No, that's not why. They're sitting down and they're being told, type in these prompts until we get a thing that looks like what we want to buy. And they're doing that because these brands do not want to get accused of stealing designs anymore. And so I will tell you more about this offline, Ruby, because I can tell you specifics that I'm not going to name here, because I heard this information from sources who swore me to secrecy to never reveal anything about their identity on the air or in my talk.
Oh my God.
But these are people who work in design for these brands. They are like, they're not allowed to create anything. They are, as designers now, technicians, right? And so this is going to, and is already making clothing even more boring than it already is. Right? And so, so like we already think clothing is kind of boring, and we often have to make a lot of concessions about what we end up getting to wear. Sewing does let you take back that narrative.
It does. Yeah. First of all, that's so upsetting.
I know. Wait till I tell you all about it. You're gonna. But
I can totally see it, and I'm sure being downgraded from designer to technician comes with a pay cut as well, or eventually will.
Yeah, eventually will, for sure.
Which is just so disappointing. But yeah, I mean, when you think about like what details in a garment matter to you, like maybe you want super deep pockets that can fit your phone and a water bottle and like a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe you want, like a two-way zipper so that like, when you sit down or something, you can unzip from the bottom, or like maybe you have certain accessibility needs that like are really hard to meet with certain garments.
Right.
You can opt into all of those details. I know also like a lot of folks, not everybody, but like a lot of folks who sew sometimes have like sensory needs where it's like, I only want to wear fabrics that feel really soft against my skin, or like I only want to wear things that are cut in a certain way where they're not going to feel like too tight around my neck or like too tight across my chest. And so you have complete creative control over all of those aspects, which is really, really exciting. You can also like tweak the fit of the garment so that it works for your body and your proportions. So like, for example, I'm petite plus, I'm 5'1", and I wear like a size 18 to 20. Anything I buy, even if I buy something from a plus size store that is like designed to fit like my girth measurements, it's going to be too long on me. So I'm always hemming stuff or buying like the 3/4 pants and wearing them as like full pants. So it's like, that's just like something to think about, is like when you start making your own clothes, all of that, like, it doesn't matter. Like, you can alter a pattern to fit your specific body and proportions, and it'll look great on you. It'll fit exactly as it's meant to. And you don't even have to think about the fact that, like, oh, I'm too short for this, or like, oh, this is hanging weird, or like hitting at a weird spot. This button is hitting in a weird place that I don't like, or like the pants are cutting across my waist in a weird spot. Like, you get to reclaim control over all of that, which is really, really pretty exciting.
Yeah. And I would also say, like, because many of us will sort of have this internalized feeling that something that we've made ourselves isn't as good as something that we bought mass produced, right? And I think that's imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
That's like legit advertising working on us and being like deeply ingrained in the folds of our brain, right? And I want to be clear that like something you made yourself is so special and just as good, if not far superior to anything you could buy. So don't let yourself be like, well, I made it, so it's like not that great.
Oh, totally. Totally. I have heard people, and I never experienced this, maybe because I just started sewing very young, but like I've heard people be worried that like I sewed this garment myself. When I put it on my body, is it going to just like fall apart?
Totally. That's
is it going to just fall off me?
Like, and everyone, it's not sewn worse.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Than if you bought it like mass produced. Yeah, but it is like, and I think it's like imposter syndrome, and it's that so much stuff in our lives is mass produced, right? That you're like, who would ever just make that on their own? Yeah. Even like the first time I made jam, I was like, well, there's no way this will be as good as anything I buy at the store, right?
Yeah.
Why? I don't know, actually, now that you mentioned it, right? And then it was like, even better, right? And so we just need to like get past that, and that is hard because it is just like baked into us at this point.
Oh, totally. Another thing that I've noticed with especially folks who are beginner sewists who are, you know, still kind of figuring out fit and still kind of figuring out like what size to sew from and what fabrics to use. A lot of times people feel like like their stuff's not going to be like as good as ready to wear, or like it's going to be like really obvious that they sewed it themselves, or they'll be like hypercritical of the fit. Like they'll sew something up and they'll be like, oh, you know, it's just like a little bit, this one seems a little bit off. I don't know. And you get kind of like hypercritical. But I would like to just point out that like there are so many ready to wear garments in this world that are just a little bit weird.
Just a little bit because they're made by humans.
Yeah. Also that like fit badly, or like there's a seam that's crooked all the time. And like we don't even notice. We just are like, no, that's machine sewn, which is not a real thing, but it's like, you know, that's made in a factory, so therefore it's like better.
I just had this conversation, Ruby, actually with a client who was like, well, like, do you think that like people when they buy stuff from me are gonna like look at the seams and look for mistakes and stuff? And I was like, I want you to go in your closet right now and go through the stuff that you've bought from brands, and you're gonna notice, you'll be like, oh, okay, clearly people do not look because I didn't notice this until now. And I think that's what's important to remember. Once again, we get in our heads like this isn't as good. Well, I would say it's even better.
Yeah. It's so true. I often can tell if somebody made their own clothes, and it's not because they look worse, it's because they look better.
Exactly. Yeah. Or you'll be like, oh my God, I've never seen anything that cool or beautiful or anything before. And I think we're so limited. I mean, you know how it is. There are years where it's like, I need a shirt and all the shirts are off the shoulder because everyone's selling the same shit.
Yep.
Right? Like, we'll take back the narrative and make the shirt that you want, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to buy what they're selling us.
Totally.
And once again, when I say these things, I'm saying like I recognize that not everybody has access to sewing or the time or the privilege of it. But I'm saying if you do and you're nervous about people thinking that you are like poor or look bad, no one's going to think that. People are going to be like, wow, that is so cool.
Totally. I got coffee with a friend the other day who's been more like sewing her own clothes, and she's wearing these very cool shorts. And as soon as we sat down, I was just like, did you make your shorts? And she was like, oh my God, like, how could you tell? And I was like, the top stitching is incredible. Like you wouldn't be able to find that at a store. Like it's just, the details are just like too cool, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Like like you had to have made it yourself. So I think, that's just like something important to call out. And, you know, also like wearing your clothes that you've made and wearing them frequently can help you kind of overcome those, you know, those setbacks or those self-doubts you might have about the quality of it. Like sometimes I'll make something, I'll let you in on a secret. I sew professionally, okay? And still, every item of clothing that I make for myself, I hate it for about 48 hours after it's finished.
I mean, I think that's like a lot of things. Any of us who ever make anything will feel the same way.
Yeah.
Very
like
normal.
I often don't live up to my own expectations of what I want something to look like, or I'll feel like something doesn't align with the vision, or it's, you know, creating too much of a visible belly outline, or the shoulder fit is weird, or the neckline's slightly crooked or something. And, you know, and I'll be like, oh, why did I even waste time on that? I can't believe I did that. Like, this is so embarrassing. Like, ugh. And, and then I kind of like let it sit or like, let it cook for a couple days. And then I'll put it back on and I'll be like, oh, this is kind of cute, actually. And then the more I start to wear it, the more it just starts to feel like, okay, this is like a normal piece of clothing in my closet.
Yeah.
But I think that's important. And I think it's like an important part of the process to just call out. It's like, even the people making those videos, like posting their final makes, like, look what I made, isn't it great? Like, they may have also had like a reckoning that you're not seeing, where they had to confront the fact that like, maybe the seam was a little crooked, maybe this part didn't press as cleanly as they wanted. Like that feeling of like disappointment, or like that feeling of like, ugh, like I didn't quite live up to the vision in my head with this thing. Like, that's really normal. It's really normal. And like, it will pass if you just like give it time to pass. Like, give yourself some distance.
Totally.
And come back to it. And you'll probably be pretty pleased with what you made.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's so true. And I would also say, like, sewing is fun, even though we made it sound really stressful.
It is. It can be really fun. So I think there's also a lot of like sewing is my therapy memes on Instagram and social media. Like, you'll see that shared a lot, or like, like, don't bother me, I'm in my sewing room, like that kind of thing. And if you think about it, especially, I don't know, folks are like introverted or extroverted, whatever. I'm kind of like somewhere in the middle. But like, it's a chunk of time that like you get to spend alone, usually like away from other people. And you're not looking at a screen, which I think so many of us look at screens all day.
Yeah.
And when you're sewing, you're like you really can't be looking at a screen, because you have to look at what you're doing with your hands. It's also like, it's really tactile. So you're using your hands. If you use like nice fabrics that feel good against your skin, like it can just have like it's soothing and like a sensory perspective sometimes. You're kind of using your whole body, even if it's not super active, but usually, you're cutting stuff out, like standing up, or, you're sewing and you're kind of like moving the fabric through the machine with your hands. There's a lot of like hand-eye coordination that's involved. There's just a lot of like sensory aspects, I think, that can be kind of nice. I personally really like the smell of the iron when I'm like using muslin or cotton fabric. There's a lot of pressing that happens in sewing. So if you are looking to get into sewing, you should probably also pick up an iron and an ironing board if you don't already have one of those.
Good call.
Because it's really one of the biggest and kind of simple secrets to making your clothing look really professional is just press your seams as you're sewing. But yeah, anytime I have to like iron muslin or like cotton fabric, like muslin is just like a plain unbleached cotton fabric. But anytime I have to iron it, just like there's just such like a nice smell. And I find it really grounding. Like, there have been times in my life where I've been like really upset or really like anxious or whatever. And like, I'll like just like be in my studio and I'll just like start ironing some fabric and I'll be like, oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I think that there is something like, whether your thing is sewing or knitting or crocheting or embroidering or making your own paper or whatever, all of these activities, they are so good for our brains and our mental health. Just to do something that is away from screens, that feels, I don't know, like you kind of just are like so in the moment and you can kind of like empty yourself out. It's a really, really good thing.
Totally. It really forces you to be present and engaged with what you're doing.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of like solving a puzzle, where it's like you're putting pieces together that fit in a particular way. You're usually following some instructions, so there's like a little bit of guidance. And it's cool to see something come together. I think I heard somebody else say this once. I wish I could remember who, but I feel like it's a very important part of this is like sewing is a chore that like once it's done, and you have like a finished thing to show for it. Like, I think so many of our household chores, like cooking and cleaning and doing laundry, it's like you do them and then you have to do it again next week, right?
Yeah.
Or you have to do it again the next day. Like, it's never really like done. You never get to just be like, and now I'm done cleaning and I'll never clean my house again. Like,
it's spotless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But sewing is one of those things where you're like, okay, like I made myself a dress. And now I have this dress, and this dress exists, and I don't have to like sew it again next week, right? Like, I'll have it for as long as I want it. And when I'm done with it, I can pass it along to somebody else, or like, alter it to be something else or whatever. But it's just like, it's complete.
Yeah, which
that's very satisfying.
Like you said, unlike anything else in our lives, right? So for people who have never sewn before or are curious about it, how do you recommend getting started on sewing?
Yeah, great question. I do think so. I used to teach kids sewing classes at this like really sweet little sewing school in New Jersey. I don't work there anymore, but I will say like teaching children and teaching adults is very different because children will just go for it. Mm-hmm. Like they have very few reservations. They're not really like expecting to be great at something when they start out because they're still kind of in this like learning phase of life, I think. So there's a lot of like, well, I'm just going to throw my all at this and we'll try it. And even if it doesn't come out great, I'm going to be really proud of it because I made a thing. Whereas adults tend to get, I think, like a lot of adults, it's like we work in a field where we've already developed a lot of competency and we're used to being good at things, right? Because we only do what we're good at for the most part, right? Like, so I think learning can be really quite challenging for adults because you have to kind of have the humility to like be bad at something for a little bit. So, you know, I will say like, just keep that in mind if you're an adult who's looking to learn how to do something new for the first time. Like it's gonna be, you're not gonna be great at it right off the bat, probably.
And that's okay.
It's totally okay. Yeah. It's totally okay. It's just about starting. It's like if you don't start today, like when are you gonna start? Because it's gonna take time. Like I think people say this with businesses too, like starting a business, right? It's like people will put off doing it because they're like, well, I'm worried I'm not gonna be good at it. But it's like, think of all the time you're wasting. Like you could start now and be bad at it for a couple years and you'll get better at it. I say as somebody who who lives that. But it's the same with sewing. It's like you need to start somewhere. So why not start now and just like start putting in those years of building skills to get to where you want to go. So in terms of where to learn, we have like local sewing schools or craft centers. A lot of times if you do have like a local fabric store or a local sewing machine store, a lot of times they'll offer classes on like how to use a machine, how to thread it, you know, how to get started. I occasionally teach like beginner sewing classes in my studio in Germantown, Philadelphia. So if you're local, you can check that out. There's also a whole bunch of other sewing schools like in my area that all kind of have different areas of expertise. So some of them teach like garments and fashion. Some teach more like home decor or like they specialize in children's classes. So look up, you know, what you're looking to learn and see if there's any like local small businesses in your area. Because usually the kinds of people who start those businesses really like to teach and they're pretty good at it, you know? So I think it's like a good place to start. Also, sometimes local libraries will offer sewing classes. I know that a lot of libraries have budgets for like community programming type stuff. So if sewing is something that you want to see, it couldn't hurt for you to like reach out to your library. And even if that's not something they're offering, you could say like, hey, is this something you ever will offer? Like just, I'm interested. There's people in my community that would be interested. You can also look for like your local art or design school or community college. A lot of times places that teach, you know, that have like fashion or costume design or textile programs will also have like continuing ed programs. So that can be a great place to learn. I used to teach for the continuing education program at Moore College of Art and Design, which is here in Philadelphia, and they have a fashion program. So this was a class that was just for like, you didn't have to be in the program. You could just be like a member of the general public in the area who just like wanted to learn pattern making, and you could take this continuing education class. So that kind of thing exists as well. Yeah. And again, just like make sure to be specific about what you want to learn because different places will have different specialties. So I know like there's a couple other sewing schools like in Philadelphia that are like quilting specific. And so if you're really looking to get into quilting, you're going to want to learn from quilters, right? Definitely. I don't really want to teach you quilting because it's not something I have like a lot of competency with. But there are people who like that is their skill set. You know, my skill set is mostly garments and like apparel construction. But then there's also people who like specialize in costume or specialize in children's wear or specialize in home decor. So there's kind of all these niches like within within sewing. So figure out, you know, what you want to put your energy into to start out. You can also find a teacher who offers private lessons if you want to do like one-on-one assistance. I often have people reach out to me that say like, I don't really know if I'd be comfortable in a class setting. I feel like I'm maybe more of a slower learner. I want more hand-holding. I want more one-on-one instruction. And so, I'm happy to work with those students on like a one-on-one, like hourly basis. And it's just kind of like music lessons, right? Like if you were going to learn guitar, you wouldn't just take one lesson, right? You would probably try to go like,
good call, yeah.
Yeah, like you would probably go a couple of times at least to like develop kind of a baseline. So I do try to like tell people that like that is pretty important. Repetition is key. Like taking one class can be great if you're just like, okay, I can get on my way. I just need to know how to thread this machine, right? Or like I can get on my way. I just need to know how to like lay out this pattern. So if it's like a one-off, that's totally fine. But I think the way to build skill is to really keep practicing over time. Try to find somebody who you vibe with. This is pretty important too. I feel very lucky that like the students that I work with are very wonderful. And like, I feel like it's usually the people that find me are looking for something very specific, whether it's like a size and gender inclusive approach to sewing or, a specific kind of like hand-holding and instruction that I can offer. But like, if you want someone who's going to teach you how to make a very, like pillows for your couches or something, or is going to teach you upholstery or something, like find somebody with that skill set and find somebody who you feel like you can spend a couple hours with, because I think that that's important, like especially everybody's got different learning styles. I don't know if you've ever taken like a music lesson from somebody who you just like did not like, but it can be awful.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's the same like finding a therapist,
totally,
like
totally.
It's just like
just
either
like
it works
that.
or it doesn't. Yeah. And be okay with that.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then just, be prepared to take more than one lesson. I think that's kind of like the hardest part for people because it is a financial investment.
Right.
And I totally get that. But like, if I think back to like that student that wanted to recreate a shirt and that we worked together for like months and months to do this project, like think how much of a skill and like how much perspective she came out of that experience with.
Right.
And like, even though it was a lot of money, it was like probably like practically like a whole semester's worth of like one-on-one instruction, So if you think about it in that regard of like, how much would you pay if you were to take this class at a university, or how, it's like, it's kind of, I don't know, like it's not valueless is what I'm trying to say, is it's like what you will get out of it is like a deeper understanding of the skills. You'll get like more of these very like specific and like nuanced aspects of the skills that will help like inform your approach for years to come. So that's also valuable. I would also say, if you are going to take private lessons, come to the lesson with a plan or a goal for the projects you want to work on. Sometimes people will just be like, I want to learn how to sew. And it's like, okay, what do you want to sew? And they're like, I don't know. So like, think about like what kind of stuff you want to make. Like, even if it's like your high, lofty, pie in the sky goal of like, I want, 3 years from now, I want to make my own wedding dress, or I want to reupholster a couch, or, make gifts for my whole family or something. Like having that can just help the instructor kind of tailor the lesson to what you actually want, so that you don't feel like you're wasting your time learning stuff that doesn't feel useful to you. And then also it's pretty typical with private lessons that you are responsible for bringing your own fabric and sewing patterns. I can provide equipment, but I can't provide materials. So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I would just be sure to ask all of those questions in advance before you show up.
Totally.
Yeah. Thank you so much to Ruby for spending approximately 100 hours with me. She'll be back, like I said, next week to give you advice on finding a secondhand sewing machine. She's very passionate about this. It was very educational for me too. She'll talk to you about how to select sewing patterns and so much more. We'll also talk about her own line of Petite Plus patterns, Starling Petite Plus. And I know that this is something that some of you are looking for because you have sent me DMs looking for them. So go check out all of Ruby's stuff. She also offers a variety of pattern making workshops and even pattern development services. I'll share all her info in the show notes so you can go check it out and give her your support. All right, This is a long episode. I'm not going to give you a whole spiel at the end, a whole pep talk, because I know you're probably tired of listening. So I'm just going to wrap up this week's episode here because, it's pretty long. If you have more thoughts or advice to share about sewing, you can send it my way via email to amanda@closeout.world. You can send an email or an audio message that you've recorded on your phone. One thing that Ruby and I discussed, which might be coming next week, but might be coming in December, depending on my final editorial decisions, is how the world of sewing can be more inclusive and welcoming, and how we can get more people into sewing and sharing that education without burning ourselves out. So if you have thoughts on that, I would love to hear that. Send it my way, and we can include it in next week's episode. All right. Well, thanks for listening to another episode of Clotheshorse, written, researched, edited, all the things by me, Amanda Lee McCarty. If you, like I said at the beginning of this episode, if you like what you hear, please leave a rating, review, of course, subscribe, and most importantly, tell your friends. If you'd like to support my work financially, there are many ways you can do that. You can find them in the show notes. You can find them at closehorsepodcast.com, and you can find them in my bio on Instagram. Once again, merch is available at closehorsepodcast.com. All orders have to be in before the 27th, or you have to wait until I come back from Japan at the end of November to get your order. And thanks, as always, to the wonderful, the fabulous, the lovely Mr. Dustin Travis White, who had an amazing little tour with his band, American Motors Group. Their album is out now if you want to check it out. And he is home now, which is how we're able to have an episode this week. So thank you, Dustin, and thank you to all of you. I'll see you all next week. Bye.